O.J. Simpson. In the summer of 1994, the most recognizable athlete in America became the defendant in what people still call the trial of the century. The evidence against him looked overwhelming. Blood drops, fibers, shoe prints, and a pair of gloves, all of it pointing in one direction. Then his attorneys did something almost no one had tried before on a stage that size. They put the evidence itself on trial, and one piece at a time, they took it apart. It was the night of June 12, 1994. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were fatally attacked outside her condominium on Bundy Drive in Los Angeles. Within hours, investigators were collecting samples across 3 locations, and within days, the prosecution had assembled what they believed was an airtight forensic chain connecting O.J. Simpson to the scene. The defense team, led by Johnny Cochran alongside Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, argued that the evidence had been contaminated, compromised, and ultimately corrupted before it ever reached a courtroom. Their proof came largely from the prosecution's own witnesses. Criminalist Dennis Fung spent roughly 9 days on the stand in April of 1995, and under questioning, he conceded a series of mistakes. Collectors had failed to change gloves between handling different items. Blood was placed in plastic bags rather than paper. Samples sat in an unrefrigerated truck for as long as 7 hours. A blood drop on the back gate was missed during the initial sweep and only collected weeks later, on July 3rd. Then there was the reference blood. Of the roughly 8 milliliters drawn from Simpson, about 1.5 milliliters could not be accounted for. Put plainly, a measurable portion of the defendant's own blood had gone missing from the evidence record, and Detective Philip Van Adder had carried the vial for hours before booking it. That gap fed the defense theory that blood had been planted. Detective Mark Furman, who had found a blood-stained glove at Simpson's estate, was discredited when recordings surfaced of him using racial slurs, and he invoked his right to silence when asked directly whether he had planted evidence. This is where the case took a turn the prosecution never expected. The same laboratory machinery that built the state's case became the instrument that dismantled it. The defense argued that another analyst had cross-contaminated samples with Simpson's reference blood, and that the gate drop contained a chemical preservative that should not appear in blood straight from the body. Cellmark's director testified that the walkway sample could have come from only about 1 person in 170 million, and she held firm that the statistics meant exactly what they said. But by then, the jury's attention had shifted from what the evidence showed to how it had been handled. On October 3rd, 1995, after only about 4 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted. 2 years later, a civil jury reached the opposite conclusion, finding Simpson liable for the deaths and ordering him to pay $33.5 million to the Goldman and Brown families. He would later serve 9 years in Nevada for an armed robbery committed in 2007, win parole in 2017, and die of cancer on April 10, 2024, at the age of 76. The financial chapter outlived him. In November of 2025, the executor of Simpson's estate accepted Fred Goldman's creditor claim for $57,997,858.12. That figure is not a typo. Yet the executor also stated the estate is worth somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, meaning the family will collect only a sliver of what the judgment says they are owed. What the Simpson trial proved was simple and uncomfortable. A genetic match is only as trustworthy as the hands that collected it. That lesson would soon cross an ocean into a hillside town in Italy, where 2 students would be convicted on forensic evidence that had been handled with even less care than the samples on Bundy Drive. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito. A single piece of evidence sat on the floor of a bedroom for 47 days before anyone picked it up. By the time it was collected, it had been photographed being passed between gloved hands, and those gloves had already touched other things. That small bra clasp and a kitchen knife from another apartment would send 2 young people to prison, and then, years later, set them free. In November of 2007, British exchange student Meredith Kircher lost her life in the apartment she shared in Perugia, Italy. Suspicion quickly fell on her roommate, Amanda Knox, and Knox's boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito. The forensic case against them rested on 2 items. The first was a kitchen knife taken from Solicito's flat, said to carry Knox's DNA on the handle and a trace linked to Kircher on the blade. The second was Kircher's bra clasp, which carried Solicito's DNA. Both were tiny, low-template samples, the kind that amplify the smallest contamination into what looks like a confident result. That fragility is exactly what the defense seized on. The clasp had remained on the bedroom floor for 47 days after the discovery before investigators retrieved it, and crime scene footage showed it being handled with dirty, repeatedly used gloves. The forensic work was overseen by Patrizia Stefanoni of the Italian Scientific Police, and for a time her conclusions held. Then came the part of the case that still does not sit right with many who study it. During the 2011 appeal, the court appointed 2 independent experts from a university in Rome to review the science from scratch. Their findings were damaging. International protocols had been violated. There was no reliable trace of Kircher's DNA on the knife at all, and the bra clasp showed DNA from multiple men, strongly suggesting it had simply picked up contamination from the environment and from the investigators themselves. The legal road that followed was long and contradictory. Knox and Solicito were convicted in 2009, with Knox sentenced to 26 years. They were acquitted on appeal in October of 2011. That acquittal was overturned by Italy's highest court in 2013. A court in Florence reconvicted them in 2014. And finally, on March 27, 2015, the Supreme Court of Cassation acquitted them for good. There was another man whose DNA had been abundant at the scene from the very beginning. Rudy Guidi was convicted in a separate proceeding and released in 2021. The contrast was stark. The evidence against him had been plentiful and direct, while the evidence against Knox and Solicito had been thin and handled carelessly. Yet for years it carried the same legal weight. One thread of the case did survive. Knox had falsely accused her former boss of involvement during the chaotic early questioning, and her slander conviction over that accusation was upheld by Italy's High Court in January of 2025, finally closing out a saga that had run for 17 years. She serves no further time and now lives in Washington State, where she writes and advocates for the wrongly convicted. Both the Simpson case and the Perugia case turned on contamination weakening real evidence in a real crime. But contamination does not always just weaken a case. Under the right conditions, it can invent a criminal who was never there at all. And across the German border, investigators were about to spend years chasing exactly that. The Phantom of Heilbronn. For 16 years, police across 3 countries hunted one woman. Her DNA turned up at 40 separate crime scenes, including 6 deaths and the fatal shooting of a young police officer. They offered a fortune for information. They logged thousands of hours. And in the end, they discovered they had been chasing someone who had never committed a single crime, because she did not exist. Between 1993 and 2009, German, Austrian, and French investigators kept finding the same unknown female DNA profile at scene after scene. The crimes had nothing obvious in common, ranging from burglaries to homicides. Yet the genetic signature tied them together. The press began calling her the woman without a face. Among the cases attributed to her was the most serious of all. On April 25, 2007, a 22-year-old police officer named Michelle Kiesewetter lost her life in Heilbronn, and the same mystery profile was found at the scene. The manhunt grew enormous. Police in Heilbronn alone logged more than 16,000 hours of overtime. A reward of 300,000 euros was offered. By some estimates, the total search cost roughly 2 million euros over the years. And the entire time, investigators were building a case around a ghost. The truth surfaced in March of 2009, almost by accident. While trying to identify a body, investigators ran a DNA test and found the phantom's female profile on the fingerprint card of a male asylum seeker. That result was biologically impossible. A man cannot carry a woman's DNA profile in his own cells. Put simply, the same woman appeared to be present at dozens of unrelated crimes across 3 nations. And now she also appeared to be a man, which meant she had never been at any of them. The DNA was not coming from the criminals. It was coming from the cotton swabs used to collect the samples. The swabs were sterile, but sterile is not the same as free of human DNA. And these had been contaminated during manufacturing by a female factory worker. There was even a clue that had been sitting in plain sight. Police in Bavaria, who sourced their swabs from a different supplier, had never once recorded the phantom. Had anyone connected that gap to the swabs earlier, the hunt could have ended years sooner. This was no longer the story of one missed detail. It was the story of how a single flawed product could corrupt 40 investigations at once. And the real crime hidden inside the false trail was finally solved through other means. Kiesewetter had actually lost her life at the hands of a neo-Nazi cell known as the National Socialist Underground. 2 of its members died by suicide on November 4, 2011, and the officer's service pistol was recovered in their possession. A 3rd member, Beate Zschäpe, was convicted of complicity in July of 2018 and sentenced to life. The scandal left a permanent mark on forensic science. It directly led to a new international standard introduced in 2016, requiring that swabs and similar forensic consumables be manufactured free of human DNA, not merely sterilized. The phantom had been a contaminant the entire time, and only when the science caught up did she finally disappear. The phantom was a stranger conjured out of a factory worker's stray cells. But the next case flips that idea on its head. This time, the man framed by contamination was very real. He had a name and a record, and his own DNA placed him at a brutal scene he was nowhere near. Lucas Anderson. On a November night in 2012, a wealthy investor was attacked inside his California estate and lost his life. Months later, police were confident they had their man. His DNA was found beneath the victim's fingernails, and he was charged with murder while facing the possibility of the death penalty. There was only one problem with the case, and it was a big one. At the exact hour the crime took place, that man was lying in a hospital bed, barely conscious, several miles away. The victim was 66-year-old Ravish Kumra, attacked during a home invasion robbery at his estate in Monte Sereno over the night of November 29th into the 30th. The man charged was Lucas Anderson, 26 years old, homeless, and carrying a felony record that had placed his profile in the DNA database. When his genetic material came back from under Kumra's fingernails, on paper, the case looked closed. What nobody on the prosecution side had checked first was where Anderson had been that night. His public defender, Kelly Kulick, and the investigators working the file pulled his medical records, and the records were airtight. Anderson had been admitted to a medical center, severely intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level around 0.40, a level that leaves a person all but incapacitated. He physically could not have been at the estate. So how did his DNA get under a dead man's fingernails? The answer changed how forensic scientists think about contamination. Earlier that same day, 2 paramedics had transported Anderson to the hospital. About 3 hours later, those same 2 paramedics responded to the Kumra estate. Somewhere in that overlap, likely through a reused pulse oximeter clip, their uniforms or shared equipment, Anderson's DNA traveled from his body to the crime scene without him ever setting foot there. It became one of the first clearly documented cases of paramedic-mediated secondary transfer, where evidence is carried in by responders rather than left by a perpetrator. The charges against Anderson were dropped in 2013, but only after he had spent about 5 months sitting in jail for a crime he could not possibly have committed. You would think a database hit treated as proof would have been double-checked against a hospital admission before a man was nearly sent toward death row. It was not, until his defense forced the question. The investigation eventually found the people actually responsible. D'Angelo Austin and Javier Garcia were convicted of first-degree murder in 2016. Marcellus Drummer received life without parole in 2014. And Katrina Fritz pleaded guilty in exchange for her testimony. The real chain of events had nothing to do with a homeless man whose cells had hitched a ride on a paramedic's equipment. Anderson walked free because, in the end, someone finally questioned the science instead of trusting the match. The man in the next case would not be so lucky so quickly. He would need 13 years and 3 separate trials before anyone seriously questioned the so-called expert who had put him there. David Camm. On a September evening in the year 2000, a former Indiana state trooper came home and found that his family was gone. Within days, investigators had decided he was responsible, and a tiny pattern of blood on his shirt became the centerpiece of the entire case against him. It would take 13 years, 3 separate trials, and the unmasking of the man on the witness stand before the truth finally came out. David Camm returned to his home in Georgetown, Indiana, on September 28, 2000, to a scene no one should ever face. His wife, Kimberly, and the couple's 2 children had lost their lives in the family's garage. Camm, who had only recently left the state police, called for help and was soon a free man no longer. The forensic case rested almost entirely on 8 small spots of blood on Camm's t-shirt. A man named Robert Stites, sent to the scene by a blood pattern analyst, testified that those spots were high-velocity impact spatter, meaning Camm had to have been present at the moment the shots were fired. On the strength of that interpretation, Camm was convicted in 2002. That conviction was overturned in 2004 because of prejudicial testimony. He was convicted again in 2006, and that verdict was overturned as well in 2009. Then the case began to come apart, and somehow it got worse for the original prosecution with each new fact. In 2005, DNA from a sweatshirt found at the scene, its collar marked with the word backbone, was matched to a felon named Charles Boney, a man with a history of attacking women. His palm print was on the family's vehicle. The defense reframed the blood on Camm's shirt entirely, arguing it was transfer staining that occurred when Camm moved through the scene to reach his family, not spatter from a shooting. The expert who had anchored the original case turned out to be the weakest link of all. Stites was profoundly unqualified. A federal court later described him as plainly unqualified, and a judge pointed to his woefully inadequate education, training, and experience. The thin credentials had been a warning sign from the start, and for years no one in the courtroom had examined them. At the third trial, States admitted under oath that he had given false testimony in the first two. The pillar of the case had confessed that the pillar was rotten. On October 24, 2013, after 13 years and 3 trials, David Cam was acquitted. Charles Boney is serving a sentence of 225 years. Cam went on to settle civil claims over his wrongful prosecution, including a settlement of $4.6 million from the state of Indiana announced on April 28, 2022, along with a separate $450,000 settlement from the county. Cam's case collapsed the moment the blood pattern expert was exposed as a fraud. But blood is only one kind of evidence that can be read wrong. Sometimes the thing that sends innocent people to prison is a single strand of hair, paired with a confession that was never true to begin with. And that is exactly where this story goes next. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo. 3 men went to prison for the death of a teenage girl, convicted largely on a confession and a handful of hairs. They served 18 years before DNA testing proved those hairs had told a lie. And what almost no one realized, even after the 3 of them finally walked free, was that the real answer had been sitting in plain reach for 4 decades, until a discarded smoothie straw gave it up. In Lynbrook, New York, in November of 1984, a local teenager disappeared on her way home from work. Her body was found weeks later, in December. The investigation moved toward 3 men, and in 1986, John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead were convicted. The case against them was built on 2 foundations. The first was a confession from Kogut, given after roughly 18 hours of interrogation and written out for him by a detective. The second was a set of hairs said to have been found in Restivo's van, which an analyst told the jury could have come from the victim with a high degree of probability. Neither foundation was as solid as it looked. Years later, Barry Scheck's Innocence Project, the group Centurion Ministries, and attorney Nina Morrison pushed for DNA testing of the biological evidence preserved from the case. The result was decisive. An intact sample proved the genetic material came from an unknown man, excluding all 3 of the convicted entirely. Their convictions were vacated in 2003. Prosecutors decided to retry Kogut anyway. This time the case went before a judge rather than a jury, and on December 21, 2005, Justice Victor Ort acquitted him. The judge found the confession was not credible, and he openly doubted whether the hairs had ever truly been in that van at all. Within days, the remaining charges against Restivo and Halstead were dismissed. You would think a confession that detailed and hairs that specific would have meant something. Once the science arrived, almost none of it held up. The aftermath divided sharply. Restivo and Halstead each won a federal civil judgment of $18 million, upheld on appeal, along with statutory compensation from the state. Kogut's civil claim, by contrast, failed. The 3 men had been freed by the same kind of evidence that convicted them. Yet the system treated their losses very differently. Then, 4 decades after the crime, the case did something cold cases almost never do. On October 14, 2025, a 63-year-old man named Richard Bilodeau was indicted. And the following day, he was arraigned before Judge Helene Gugerty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The break had come from DNA on a discarded smoothie straw, recovered in February of 2024. which was matched to the 1984 sample through the Othram Laboratory and FBI genetic genealogy. The district attorney, Ann Donnelly, put it bluntly, saying the DNA does not lie and that they had finally found the right man. Bilodeau has maintained his innocence, and the case is pending. The hairs in that van convicted 3 innocent men in a single courtroom. The next case shows what happens when bad forensic science and a coerced confession meet a community that has already made up its mind, and 3 teenagers pay the price for it in Arkansas. The West Memphis Three. In 1993, a town in Arkansas was certain it had found the people responsible for the deaths of 3 young children. 3 teenagers were arrested. 1 was sentenced to death, and a frightened community told itself that justice had been done. So why are all 3 of those men free today? And why does the state still list the case as officially unsolved? On May 5th, 1993, 3 young children went missing in West Memphis and were later found to have lost their lives in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. The discovery landed in the middle of a wave of fear about supposed satanic activity, and that fear shaped everything that followed. 3 teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., were charged. Eccles was sentenced to death. Baldwin and Miskelly received life. The case rested heavily on a confession from Miskelly, given after a long interrogation despite his low IQ, and it was riddled with details that did not match the known facts. You would think a confession that contradicted the evidence would raise alarms. Instead, it became the centerpiece of the prosecution. The forensic case eroded over time. Testimony about the injuries was later challenged, with experts arguing the wounds were more consistent with animal activity than with a weapon. Then, in 2007, mitochondrial DNA testing excluded all 3 convicted men. A hair recovered from the items used to bind the children was found to be consistent with one boy's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, and a second hair from the scene was consistent with a friend of his. Hobbs has never been charged and denies any involvement. After the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a review of the DNA findings and juror misconduct claims in 2010, the 3 men took an unusual path out. On August 19, 2011, they entered Alford pleas, a maneuver that let them maintain their innocence, while formally conceding the state had enough evidence to convict. They were freed with time served after 18 years behind bars. The story is far from finished. As of 2025, the case remains officially unsolved. In 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court affirmed, by a vote of 4-3, Eccles' right to advanced testing. And on August 1st, 2025, Circuit Judge Tanya Alexander ordered 15 pieces of evidence, including the hairs and the shoelace bindings, sent to Bode Laboratories in Virginia for a sensitive form of touch DNA testing. The evidence was formally shipped in November of 2025, with results still to come. The prosecutor, Sonia Haygood, acknowledged that the testing might finally provide the answer that explains the entire case. In West Memphis, flawed science and a coerced confession destroyed 3 lives in one set of trials. The next man took that same kind of damage and multiplied it, spreading it across an entire crime lab and hundreds of cases, all on the word of one analyst. Fred Zane. For 10 years, a single forensic analyst in West Virginia took the witness stand and told juries that the science pointed straight at the defendant. People trusted him. Prosecutors built their cases around his certainty. Then investigators finally took a hard look at his actual work. And what they found was that much of what he had sworn to under oath had simply been invented. Fred Zane worked in the West Virginia State Police Crime Lab from 1979 to 1989, heading the Serology Division from 1986, before moving on to a lab in Bezoar County, Texas. He had secured his position in part through false credentials, and that early dishonesty set the tone for everything after. His fraud first surfaced through the case of Glendale Woodall, convicted in 1987 partly on Zane's testimony that the blood types involved were identical to Woodall's. DNA testing later exonerated Woodall, and his case was dismissed in 1992. He won a $1 million settlement. That single reversal was the thread that, once pulled, unraveled the whole garment. A Kanawha County prosecutor triggered an investigation, and the West Virginia Supreme Court appointed Judge James Holliday to examine Zane's record. His report, delivered in November of 1993, was devastating. Zane had misstated evidence, falsified results, and reported findings that were scientifically impossible. The court ordered the preservation of evidence in 134 cases and concluded that his misconduct struck at the heart of the integrity of every prosecution he had ever touched. The damage kept compounding. Time and again, a new name surfaced from the wreckage of his career. Multiple men were exonerated, among them Gilbert Alejandro, who became the first person in Texas exonerated by DNA evidence and won $250,000. Each case raised the same uncomfortable question about how many more verdicts had been built on testimony that was never true. Zane himself never truly answered for it. He was indicted, but he was never convicted. There was an acquittal on one count in 1995 and a hung jury in 2001, and a perjury charge was blocked by the statute of limitations. He died of cancer in December of 2002 in Ormond Beach, Florida, with most of the cases still being sorted out. West Virginia paid at least $6.5 million in settlements, and the fallout continued for years. As late as 2016, Jimmy Gardner's 1987 conviction was thrown out because of Zane's involvement. Zane corrupted evidence with nothing more than a pen and his own willingness to lie on the stand. In Wisconsin, the accusation was very different. There, the claim was that someone had corrupted the evidence with a vial of old blood and a hole in its stopper. Stephen Avery. Stephen Avery had just won back his freedom. After 18 years in prison for a violent assault he did not commit, DNA had cleared his name, and he was suing the county that had locked him away for $36 million. He was about to become a national symbol of everything broken in the justice system. At least, that was the story, right up until a young photographer went missing. Avery was exonerated in 2003 after serving those 18 years for a 1985 assault on a woman named Penny Burnson. With his wrongful conviction suit against Manitowoc County still pending, in November of 2005, he was charged with the death of photographer Teresa Halbach, who had visited his property and was never seen alive again. The defense built its case around a single central claim: that the evidence had been planted. A vial of Avery's blood, stored since 1985, was discovered with a puncture hole in its stopper, raising the possibility that blood had been drawn from it to stain Halbach's vehicle. Stored blood contains the preservative known as EDTA, which does not occur naturally in blood fresh from the body. The defense argued that if EDTA were present in the blood found in the car, it would prove the sample had been planted. The FBI testified that its testing found none. The questions did not stop there. Manitowoc deputies, the very officers caught in a conflict of interest because of Avery's lawsuit, were the ones who located Halbach's car key after several earlier searches had turned up nothing, and a bullet fragment surfaced later still. To the defense, The timing of those discoveries was the whole case. To the prosecution, it was simply thorough police work. Avery was convicted in 2007. His nephew, Brendan Dassey, who was 16 at the time and had a low IQ, gave a confession that he later recanted as coerced, and he was convicted as well. That confession became its own long legal battle. A federal magistrate overturned it in 2016, but the full Seventh Circuit reinstated it the following year by a vote of 4-3, and the Supreme Court declined to review the matter in 2018. The entire saga reached a global audience through the Netflix series Making a Murderer. It is worth being precise here, because this case is genuinely contested. The planting theory was never proven. The FBI's testing did not support it, and courts have repeatedly upheld the conviction. As of 2025, both men remain imprisoned. The Wisconsin Supreme Court denied Avery's latest bid involving alternate suspect evidence, and a January 2025 appeals decision went against him. Dassey may be eligible for extended supervision around the year 2048. As of 2025, several of these cases are still moving through the courts. With new testing underway and at least one new suspect awaiting trial. The same forensic science that once helped convict the wrong people is now the tool working hardest to correct the record. The evidence, at long last, is being read for what it actually is. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video